Começa agora o Frontiers Unlocked, a revista ao vivo da MIT Sloan Review Brasil. Sejam muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas à nossa última edição do ano. E que ano, não é mesmo? Bom, para quem já conhece o nosso evento, essa edição do Frontiers chega com uma novidade. Ele vai durar uma semana inteira. Nós começamos hoje com a sessão de abertura que está para lá de especial. Na terça, quarta e quinta-feira, sempre das 18 às 20 horas, nós preparamos palestras e painéis com participações incríveis. E no sábado, das 9 da manhã ao meio-dia, mais ou menos, a gente dá um mergulho final em mais conteúdos de altíssimo nível. Ou seja, nos dias úteis, você janta com mais sabedoria. E no sábado, você inicia o dia recebendo insights de quem está à frente da inovação no Brasil. Que tal, hein? Se eu fosse você, eu não perderia. Hashtag fica a dica, hein? Bom, o tema desta quarta edição do Frontiers é Toda empresa é uma empresa de tecnologia. A partir dele, nós vamos falar de todos os aspectos possíveis para você conseguir transformar também a sua empresa numa empresa de tecnologia. E agora, eu convido o Pedro Nascimento, CEO da MIT Sloan Review Brasil, para falar do que nos aguarda. Com você, Pedro.
Muito obrigado, Ângela. Eu confesso que eu estou até emocionado para esse começo de evento, apesar de já ser a quarta edição que eu oficialmente abro esse ano. Eu não tenho dúvida que essa vai ser muito especial. Eu estava agora conversando com o nosso maravilhoso convidado no backstage e não tenho dúvida que vai ser uma sessão absolutamente incrível. Eu vou ser muito breve nessa minha primeira apresentação. Acho que vocês já sabem que esse é o último Frontiers do ano. Não por acaso, ele está acontecendo agora em dezembro. E vocês também já sabem que ele vai durar a semana inteira, né? Como a Ângela muito bem passou, a gente, nessa última edição, vai ter uma programação muito diferente, com uma palestra de abertura hoje, 3 dias de programação à noite, que seriam os dias para quem participou dos outros Frontiers quando a gente teve as outras edições, e também uma programação no sábado. E vocês também já sabem que o tema é toda empresa é uma empresa de tecnologia. Inclusive, e aí eu vou pedir só para me apoiarem com a passagem do slide, se vocês puderem nos marcar em todos os insights que vocês tiverem sobre eventos, se vocês acharam uma coisa legal, se ficou alguma coisa que marcou vocês nessa palestra incrível que a gente vai ter hoje, é só marcar a gente com o hashtag MIT Frontiers, que a gente vai estar fazendo a cobertura do evento no Instagram e no Twitter. Agora, o que talvez vocês não saibam sobre Frontiers, e aí peço novamente para passar o slide, é que a gente só consegue fazer ele gratuitamente, de forma absolutamente democrática, porque a gente tem a parceria do SaaS Brasil, empresa que é super craque em analytics e dados, e eu quero fazer um agradecimento super especial ao SaaS, que tem ajudado a gente a disseminar o conhecimento para que as empresas e os gestores fiquem realmente fluentes em dados e realmente future ready, capacitados para atuar nesse futuro de quarta revolução industrial. O que talvez vocês não saibam também, e peço para passar novamente, é que para apoiar vocês em todas as transições necessárias que os insights que essa edição vai trazer, a gente quer apoiar com o nosso conteúdo. E durante o Frontiers, qualquer pessoa tem 50% de desconto na assinatura da MIT Sloan Review Brasil. Edição impressa ou digital, ou na somente digital. E vale destacar também, já caminhando para o convite do nosso convidado, é que essa sessão vai ser em inglês. Então, nosso convidado super especial está falando com a gente diretamente da Califórnia. Se você preferir assistir a tradução simultânea, não tem problema, você pode assistir na maravilhosa voz da Gabi, no link que a gente vai enviar aqui diretamente na barra de comentários do YouTube, vocês vão poder acessar o link com tradução simultânea. Bem, se o tema desse Frontiers é tecnologia, a gente vai começar com um tema que é absolutamente a fundação da tecnologia, que é a matemática. Mas a gente não quer falar da matemática de um jeito chato, que, imagino que muitos de vocês que estão participando com a gente aqui hoje, desse primeiro dia de Frontiers, acabaram aprendendo matemática ou lidando com a matemática como se fosse algo chato, maçante, cansativo. A gente vai falar de matemática inclusiva. E para falar desse tema, a gente não poderia ter um convidado melhor. Dr. Francis Edward Su. Welcome, Professor. Let's wait for Angela to introduce you properly.
Olha, o professor Francis Su ele é um matemático americano, filho de chineses e PhD em Harvard. E acreditem, ele já se sentiu rejeitado por um professor de matemática um dia. E essa foi uma das experiências que levou o professor a ter um novo olhar para a matemática e também um novo olhar para o ensino dessa disciplina. Como presidente da Associação dos Matemáticos da América, o professor Su desenvolveu uma visão inclusiva da matemática. Vocês imaginam ver uma relação de causa e efeito entre toda a matemática que estudamos com nossa capacidade de satisfazer nossos maiores desejos e necessidades? Pois é, o professor Su, ele mostra essa relação. Ele mostra como aritmética, álgebra e geometria não servem apenas a quem vai trabalhar com matemática, como os engenheiros, e servem para todo mundo que quer ter uma vida plena, inclusive as pessoas de humanas, como eu, que penso em matemática e já sinto arrepio na alma, né, gente? O seu mais recente livro, que está na tela, fala disso. Traduzindo para o português, o título significa Matemática para o Florescimento Humano, e foi lançado neste ano pandêmico. Então, para a gente ir logo ao que interessa, eu trago aqui a definição que a revista Wired usou para apresentar o professor Su, e que a gente gostou muito e vai repetir aqui. O professor Su é o matemático que vai fazer você se apaixonar pelos números. Please welcome Professor Su.
Boa noite.
Boa noite. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us today. It's an honor and pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Professor, I'd love to start this conversation about mathematics and mathematics for human flourishing with, I think, a little bit of context about Brazil. You know, even though I'm actually a mathematics lover that went a little, went away from it and then came back to it. And in a way, an article I read about you helped a lot in this coming back to it. When we look at the numbers in Brazil, there are some things that, in a way, it's important to emphasize. So, for example, there's been a research in Brazil back in 2015, which revealed that, most of the adults, 25-year-old or more, do not know how to do simple mathematical operations. So 75% of the respondents, for example, do not know simple averages. 63% cannot answer questions about percentages, which is, for example, really important for, finance in general. 75% do not understand fractions. And, our PISA scores tell us that we will not have a better picture with the new generation. So, for example, 43% of the students scored below the minimum level of proficiency in mathematics. There's, and when we ask people about it, when we ask, I can remember my mother talking about mathematics with my mother, people in Brazil usually don't like it. They think it's boring. They think it's hard. They think it's a burden. They think they're not going to use it in their life, in their careers. And I've heard that a lot.
Yeah.
So after all this kind of grim introduction about mathematics in Brazil, what I'd love to ask you to start a conversation is, how can people, how can we see it in a different way? We know for a fact that mathematics is needed in the future of work. Everyone is saying that, you can't have a job in maybe 5 or 10 years if you don't know anything about data or analytics. So how can we change our relationship with math? And how are you changing people's relations with math?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the kinds of issues you're describing are not that unique to Brazil. I mean, certainly in the U.S., if you ask the general public, their impressions of math, often people have a very negative reaction. And part of that is because people had bad experiences, not necessarily with mathematics itself, but with the way that it's taught. One of the things that, every kid has to do when they're a kid is just memorize a bunch of math facts for instance, right? Like memorize your times tables. And, if you think a little bit about what we're doing when we ask kids to memorize things, is we're asking them in some sense to turn off their brains. And, kids naturally have a curiosity, they have a wonder, they want to know why things are true. And if we just tell them you have to memorize these things without helping them make sense of it, then of course it's going to seem very dry and boring, right? So, one of the things I often like to do when people ask, well, wait a minute, isn't it important for kids to memorize things? As I say, well, actually, there are many ways you can have people remember things that don't involve, memorization, right? Like if I have people look at the patterns in a times table, often the kids will notice some patterns, and those patterns will help them remember, okay, if I want to multiply something by 5, then it's going to end in 5 or 0, right? That's a pattern. And if you notice it, and if you make that discovery yourself, it's actually really easy to remember. And so, in many ways, part of what I'm trying to do when I talk about mathematics as being connected to human desires is I'm trying to help people see that math, when it's taught properly, actually can appeal to certain basic human desires we all have. And if we think about math as being human, then it actually makes us think about how to teach it differently. We wouldn't necessarily put people in mathematics situations where they're being forced to do things that are unpleasant or uncomfortable in some ways.
And Professor, I'd like to bring to our conversation a character from your 2020 book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing, which I'm reading, by the way, which is Christopher. Could you tell who he is and why he has inspired you to write your book?
Yeah. So Christopher is an inmate, an incarcerated man in a federal prison here in the U.S. He's been in trouble with the law since he was a teenager, and he is now in prison for 32 years for a series of armed robberies that he committed when he was just a teenager. And several years ago, he wrote me a letter basically asking for my help in furthering his education in mathematics. He had discovered math while in prison and started reading a bunch of different books and then got curious and more fascinated by mathematics. And so he wrote me out of the blue. I didn't know who he was. He wrote me a letter basically asking for help in furthering his math education. And one of the things that, over the years now, we've been writing letters back and forth, and we've gotten to know each other quite well, and are friends now. And you'll hear, as you know, reading the book, you'll hear his story and also hear from him as well, as he's an official contributor to the book. And one of the things that I think is really changed the way that I think about mathematics is I teach math for a living, right? So it certainly shouldn't surprise me that I think math actually has something to offer everybody. But, even with somebody like Christopher, you think, oh my gosh, somebody who's been in trouble with the law, like, is that somebody that I normally associate with somebody who could get interested and fascinated by mathematics? Right? I mean, it's sort of forced me to really grapple with this question. Do I really believe that math has something to offer everybody? And after meeting somebody like Christopher, you have to say, of course it does, right? I mean, Chris's life has been changed because he's discovered the beauty and the wonder and the power of mathematics.
That's amazing, just amazing. And it's interesting because I remember when I read an article of your speech about these virtues that the mathematics, in a way, develops in us. And I remember reading it maybe 2 or 3 months after I started again studying mathematics. And I remember reading it and feeling that, it made sense, but it made sense in not a rational way. So, for example, when you talked about beauty, you know, I don't know how to describe it, but after you start to understand the underlying stuff that makes the universe and how mathematics work, and it's beautiful, but not beautiful in the usual way. So my next question to you would be, what are those virtues that in a way you've noticed that mathematics help people develop?
Yeah, that's great question. I like to talk about human desires and human virtues. And human desires are things like a desire for beauty, for truth, for play, a desire for justice, a desire for love. These are all human desires, basic human desires that everybody has. And part of what I argue in my book is that by pursuing mathematics through the lens of these desires, you actually build virtues that help you, that they serve you well no matter what you do in your life, no matter what profession you go into, right? So if I have a desire for beauty, then I basically am drawn to look for enchanting ideas, right? And if I have a desire for truth, then I build in myself the virtue of deep investigation. So if I want to learn something well, I will learn multiple ways of understanding the same idea, right? This is a practice you build in mathematics, right? You learn to ask, is my answer reasonable? Are there other ways that I could solve this problem? And do these two things line up, right? These two understandings line up. And if they do, you're like, I understand this in a deeper way. And if they don't, you realize you made a mistake somewhere, right? So this is a virtue that's built by pursuing mathematics for its truth, right? And so what I argue is that those kinds of virtues are actually much more important than the specific skills you learn in math, right? Like the specific skills might be factoring a quadratic equation, right? But a specific virtue is the virtue of deep investigation of an idea, right? Or the virtue of the hopefulness that's built by struggling for a long time with a problem and then eventually solving it, right? You're building in yourself this ability to hope for a solution and then see that hope realized, right? So these are all virtues that are built in us. And these things, no matter what profession you go into, actually serve you well. And so, part of the answer to the question, everybody asks, why am I learning this mathematics? Well, one answer is, yes, there are potentially some things you'll use, some skills you'll take away. But I think a much more important answer to that question is, look at the way that you're shaping your mind because of what you're learning through mathematics. And so math can be a place of wonder and a place of awe, a place of enchantment, a place of deep struggle, but pushing through that struggle and getting to the other side. That's an experience of a thrill that all of us should have the experience someday of having.
When you were talking, Francis, I was just remembering spending 7 hours yesterday working in this problem set I had for my statistics class. And, it was tough. And there were times that I was like, I want to throw everything up and forget about it. And then coming back to it and being able to solve it, it's like it's strange, right? It's this, as you said, this beauty, this hopefulness.
Yes. And that's a hopefulness that not everybody has, right? Like if you have grown up in an environment where maybe you aren't asked to think about, taught to ask good questions. If you're grown up in an environment maybe of deep poverty, where you have these huge problems that are actually unsolvable or feel very unsolvable, then maybe you don't have a certain hope that that hard problems can be solved. And so that's one of the great benefits of mathematics. That's why it's such a great equalizer. No matter who you are, whatever background you come from, if you start learning mathematics and you realize hard problems can actually be solved, that's actually something that carries with you to other areas of your life, right? You begin to believe that actually, if I put my mind to it, I might be able to actually make some progress on this problem, even if it's not a math problem. That's a huge benefit of a huge virtue that's built by the practice of math.
And for instance, this is, you know, teaching and maybe educating better in mathematics. Is this an issue that we could only solve it when we were young, or people can still learn it and can still develop those virtues if they start studying or if they rediscover it after they are older?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I hope it's still available to me now that I'm not no longer a young person. Yeah, I think there's this myth that somehow math is only something for young people in some ways, like the best mathematics is done by the, you know, the young hotshot geniuses or whatever. And that's, you know, there's a certain narrative that people tell about mathematics, but it's not the most common experience that people have in math. I mean, you certainly can grow in mathematical wonder, and you can grow in your mathematical virtues and your skills, certainly at any time in life. And everybody should have the ability to experience that.
And for instance, there's one of those explanations you gave about the virtues, the one about hope. I think it's thrilling. As I share with you, it's something I experienced like yesterday. And you said once that when you sit with the problem long enough, you're actually exercising hope that you'll eventually solve it right. And also said that exercising hope actually equips you to solve the next problem, even if you don't solve the current one. Is this the way it happens in our lives? Because one thing we've been wondering is, you know, there's a lot of intelligent fellows today, especially with the pandemics, that seem to believe that hopeful people are maybe silly or naive or maybe romantic in some way. So are those virtues something that everyone that goes into the study of mathematics should strive for?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you know, this idea of somehow math being, you know, having the hopefulness that hard problems can be solved. You know, sometimes people often say mathematical innovations or mathematical tools seem like magic, right? Like if you just take your iPhone, think about like 20 years ago, you know, when this thing really didn't exist as it is, this thing would seem like magic, right? Like we had Star Trek episodes, science fiction episodes where people are using little things like this, devices to do things, right? There's a lot of mathematics behind that, and it often seems like magic. And why does it seem like magic? It's because people haven't necessarily built this virtue of having hopefulness that hard problems can be solved. And so when you see a hard problem solved, it looks like magic, right? So part of this, I think this question that you're asking is like, you know, in this certain time right now, you know, we have, if you think of hopeful people as naive or silly or romantic, well, you know, you just have to point them to many of the wonderful advances that mathematics has made possible, just to say, hey, you know, this isn't just a silly romantic notion, right? The idea that I can organize information and use a search engine to find, you know, really good results, that's a mathematical innovation, right? It was made possible by the linear algebra of the 1800s, right? And somehow now, even today, we're able to harness that power from, you know, more than 100 years ago to actually answer questions that we want solved, the practical problems. So yeah, I wouldn't be sad at being accused of being silly or naive or romantic.
And Professor, you what you said about, for example, linear algebra. For example, I was studying statistics, which is something some guys developed maybe 300 years ago. But at the same time, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that the mathematics people are using to innovate today, much of it didn't even exist maybe 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Does it mean that, mathematics is a living creature, that there's a lot out there to discover?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's another, I think you're addressing another misconception that people often have of math, which is it's all stuff that was invented and discovered, centuries ago. And just even today, part of what mathematicians do is we try to solve problems of current interest, right? And, some of the problems that we want to solve, like, when people started developing the internet and, then, so the mathematics of networks actually becomes really important. And there's been some work that's been done on that that we can point to. But then there's also new questions that it brings up, right? Like, certainly 100 years ago when linear algebra was developed, people couldn't have imagined what a search engine is, much less what the internet is, right? So some of that math is useful, but there are some questions that the mathematics of search engine motivates that are new, and you might want to try to solve that question. I'm reminded of an example. My PhD advisor is actually well known as not just as a mathematician but as a magician. His name is Percy Diaconis, and he was trained as a magician, and then realized at some point that he needed to learn some math. He wanted to understand how card shuffling works. And so he's actually well known for having proved very recently, by recently I mean early 1990s, that if you ask a question and you take a deck of cards, like this deck of cards, you can ask, how many times do you have to shuffle it before it's mixed well enough, right? So there's a question that people have been playing cards for centuries, right? But there's a question that whose precise answer wasn't actually answered until 1992, right? Like, how many shuffles does it take to mix a deck of cards? How many would you say?
4.
Okay, so that's a good quote. That's a good guess. Do you think it's 4? Do you think it's 40? Do you think it's 400? Right? Well, if you take this deck and you riffle shuffle it, which is what most people do, they cut the deck and they split it into 2 parts and they interleave the pieces. It turns out that the 7 shuffles is about the right answer for a deck of 52 cards, right? That was not known until just relatively recently, right? 1992. That was a question of current interest, and you could ask all sorts of follow-up questions, right? What if the deck is more than 52 cards, right? How does the answer depend on the number of cards? There's another question, right? What about other kinds of card shuffles, right? So if you take the card shuffle, the card shuffle technique where people often pick off, it's the overhand shuffle where you sort of pick off things off the top. So sometimes people shuffle the deck like this. That's actually a really bad method of shuffling. It's way worse than the riffle shuffle. For 52 cards, it takes something like 2,500 shuffles to actually mix the deck in a way that the deck is actually random, right? So lots of interesting questions that still math is evolving and changing even today, for sure.
And Professor, I'm seeing the comments over here, and one thing that's pretty inspiring to me is how many people are writing about a teacher they had in school or a teacher they had some time ago of mathematics, which made them go into it and study more and learn more from it. So my follow-up question would be, as an advocate for inclusive mathematics, what kind of teacher would you recommend for a country that people don't like it that much? For when people usually go to social sciences, not that much into math. We're starting with this movement and having more engineers and more computer scientists. What would a teacher need to be a good mathematics teacher in this environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that one of the things that makes a really great math teacher is somebody who values questions, more than valuing good answers, right answers, right? Somebody who actually is able to ignite curiosity. So, you know, you could, for instance, if all a teacher does is just evaluate your worksheet and decide if you got an answer right or wrong, that really doesn't do you much good, right? Like, it's actually much better if someone comes alongside you and says, you know, it prompts you, motivates you to ask another question that you feel motivated to go and explore, right? So one of the things that's very shown to be very effective is when teachers teach students in what's often called here in the U.S. active learning or discovery learning, where you guide students to make discoveries for themselves. Because you know what, if you discover something, you'll be much more likely to remember it than if you were asked to just memorize, right? And so a teacher who pays attention to your interests, you know, and then looks at ways at connecting mathematics to the interests that you have, right? Not the ones that they want you to have necessarily. I think these are all qualities of an excellent math teacher. Somebody who fosters a connection and community among students, right? There's really, you know, it's a shame if you're going to be in a classroom and you don't take advantage of the fact that there are, you know, 20 other people there who are learning together, right? So how can you create an environment where people value each other and value what each other brings to the table? And that can be, of course, difficult if people are different levels. But that's, I think, part of what it means to be an inclusive mathematical community is that you feel at home, no matter where you are, no matter what your background is, right? You know, I think a little bit about my experience doing things that I'm not really good at, right? Like going hiking, right? And, you know, often when you go in these hiking groups, there's like the advanced group, the intermediate group, and the beginners group. And I'm always in the beginners group, right? But what would it look like to have no shame at being a beginner, right? How do you build an environment like that? Or if, for instance, you learn to play music, right? As long as you're not with a bunch of, you know, musical snobs, no matter what level you're at, you shouldn't feel embarrassed to play music. And you certainly shouldn't be afraid to be inspired by beautiful music, you know, by listening to the music of others.
And Professor, I believe that you talked about the math in the cauliflower, which is a fractal, right? So you talk about the patterns in nature, for example, in a cauliflower, and I suppose we could talk about, for example, about patterns in forests, like our rainforest here in Brazil. Do you think math could help us understand and value nature more?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think you're referring to this thing called a Romanesque cauliflower, which has a very self-similar design at all scales, right? You zoom in and it looks similar to the whole cauliflower. Yeah, so math certainly appears in lots of aspects of nature. In fact, there's many mathematicians who try to understand patterns in nature, right? Why does a leopard have spots, right? How do spots form on the coats, the furs of various animals? And math, I think, can help us understand what's going on, and that's part of what makes, you know, math wonderful and interesting, and can help us appreciate nature. I mean, one of the ways I love to think about math and describe math to others is math is the power to see hidden patterns in the world, right? Hidden patterns that are all around us. You know, they could be in nature, right? Like the spots on a leopard, or they could also be in data, right? This is a very hot topic these days, is how do you make sense of the data around us? You know, if you think about voice recognition software, that's basically what it's doing. It's trying to listen to what you're saying, to the sound patterns, and try to understand what you're saying. And so, yeah, math has a power to see hidden patterns. And who wouldn't want to see hidden patterns, right? Like that's something that should motivate us all to learn math.
And it's interesting what you're saying about, you know, learning to perceive those patterns. Like it's like we had a different language, right? We can access different things that we couldn't access before. Like, for example, learning, for example, learning English, you can access different things. So talking about the importance of, knowing math to access this different kind of knowledges in general, could you tell us that story about the secret menu, about the importance of, being able to speak a different language in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just to build on your idea about languages, it just brought to mind something, and then I'll talk about the secret menu. So one of the things that you talked about is thinking about what it's like to learn a language, and in some ways, math is like learning a different language, and I like that analogy. One of the reasons I like that analogy is that nobody ever says to a kid, you're bad at languages, don't even bother learning a language, right? Everybody can grow in their ability to speak whatever whatever their native tongue is, right? We don't tell babies you're a language person and you're not a language person. But somehow in math, we have this thing where we tell people you're a math person and you're not a math person, right? And people develop these negative feelings or identities around mathematics, which they would never do around something like language, something like music or art, right? Yes, there are some people who are really fantastic artists, but it doesn't mean that all of us can't grow in our ability to do art, right? The secret menu analogy that you mentioned is one that I guess I came to when I started, when I go to restaurants, a Chinese restaurant in particular. You might look at me and say, wait a minute, you're Chinese, right? Like, yeah, but I don't speak Chinese because I'm Chinese American and I grew up in the US. So when I go to a Chinese restaurant, people often look at me and think, because I don't speak Chinese, that I must be, I must not be really Chinese, right? So I get a completely different menu. So at a Chinese restaurant, if you're not Chinese, you get a standard menu. But at the authentic Chinese restaurant, there's a secret menu, right? That they only give Chinese people, right? It has all the good stuff. It has all the authentic Chinese foods, right? And I don't get that menu unless I ask for it. And so, part of, this thinking about this made me think, actually mathematics is often like that, right? There are some people that we think of as good at math, or we expect to be good at math, and we give them the secret menu. And then to other people, we say, no, you really won't like the stuff on that menu, right? And in so doing, we discourage people away from mathematics that otherwise might have had a wonderful experience doing it. And this is actually really harmful and really sad that that people are being turned away from experiencing one of the great pleasures in life, I think, which is mathematical thinking and experience the wonder and the beauty of mathematical thinking.
And Professor, one thing that we've been thinking a lot about, we're connected to a really science-driven institution, which is MIT. And one thing that in a way worries us is that all over the world, we're seeing this wave of negationism of science. So there are people denying climate change. There are people denying vaccines against COVID-19 or even against measles, and so on. So the question would be, denying science equals denying math. Do you believe math could help more people connect to science and I feel bad just using this term, but believe in science more? What's your guess about this?
Yeah. I mean, certainly math and science go hand in hand in many ways. I mean, mathematics builds in us an ability to reason, and certainly reason quantitatively, which is really important in the sciences, to be able to make deductions, to be able to say, if this happens, then that happens, right? This is something mathematical thinking certainly cultivates in us in very in unique ways. And so, I would definitely say that math contributes to an ability to think scientifically and use that well. And certainly we need that even more so now in a day when we're fighting a terrible pandemic, and we know very little about it, and we're trying to learn more, right? So we're trying to understand how it is that we can curb this pandemic. That requires scientific thinking. It requires mathematical thinking. It requires models that help explain what's going on, and it requires deductive reasoning for us to be able to make sense of things.
It's interesting, Professor. When I was studying statistics, there's this problem, this paradox about the false positive, which is pretty well known. The one about, you ask if someone probably has this disease when you have these probabilities, and medics usually say it's 95% chance, but actually the real number is something around 12%. So we were actually in a meeting from our team talking about how in Brazil, for example, statistics is something that we don't like or we don't learn that much. And in many ways, much of the narrative we usually have when we talk about, for example, what's happening right now in the pandemic, so solutions like vaccines and so forth, it's based on, shaky grounds. I see some lines in the newspaper, and mathematically they're wrong, like this one about the 95%. So do you think maybe we needed more mathematical thinking in those who communicate, like us, for example? We are communicators per se.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, part of what statistics helps us do is deal with uncertainty and risk, right? And I like to say statistics is about being a good detective with data, right? You're given a bunch of data, and you need to make sense of it in some ways. And you want to answer a particular question, like, is this vaccine more effective than a placebo? Right? There's a question that you can ask. And then you design an experiment or a way of testing whether your hypothesis is actually true. And so statistics actually helps us to be good detective of data. It's not going to, there's not going to be necessarily a hard and fast answer to that question because you have this uncertainty. But what you're trying to do is manage the uncertainty. So if you, for instance, take a large enough sample size, or you try the placebo and the vaccine on enough people, hopefully you'll be able to control that uncertainty so that it's can give us an answer to the question. And so that's part of what statistics helps us to do. And now, of course, I've forgotten what the main thrust of your question was. You mentioned statistics. I wanted to mention that.
Actually, it was that one. Why is needed, especially for communicators, to learn it? Because
Yeah. So part of what the general public needs is an understanding of what some of these statistical concepts are, so that they can make sense of it in their own world. And I don't know how it is in Brazil, but in the U.S., everybody in high schools funneled through calculus, and we're just now, relatively recently, trying to change that so that calculus isn't like the bottleneck that's keeping everybody, caught. If they don't take calculus, they can't move on. And part of what we're trying to do now is introduce more statistics earlier into the curriculum so that high school students know it, understand it. It's probably one of the most useful things, practically speaking. Calculus is great. It's a triumph of the human imagination, but it may not be something that every high school student necessarily needs to know in a way that's, for instance, statistical thinking is.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember my first semester in engineering school learning calculus without having seen anything like limits before. So it was pretty, sudden for me to to learn it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think so. Part of what we need to think about as we go forward, certainly in this day and age, is what about a mathematical education is essential, right? You can drill down on skills all you want, but if you learn to take a derivative sometime as college student. And I'm probably guessing you haven't really needed to take a derivative much in your life since then, if you haven't been doing much engineering, right? So, part of I think what needs to change is how we message what it is we're offering students, right? I want students to come away from my math class realizing they're a better thinker as a result. Certainly, I hope they appreciate like the fact that calculus is one of the triumphs of the human mind and imagination, that you can actually get real answers to things that seem impossible. But I also hope that people realize that there's a lot more to math than just calculus. For instance, there's a lot of other things that are worth learning about and exploring and enjoying.
And Professor, just as a side note, when you talk about how calculus is one of the triumphs of the human mind, I remember learning it and learning that you guys developed the same thing, Leibniz and Newton, in different places, almost at the same time.
Yeah,
it's like you can be at least humble and honored as a human being after you learn that, right?
Yeah, and I think this really points out in some ways both to the ingenuity of human beings, but also to in some ways people might think of as the eternal nature of mathematics, right? Like the fact that different people in different cultures in different times, separated by oceans, can still have the same mathematical thought. It does bring up interesting philosophical questions. Why is that? Unless there were some external reality, which some might talk about as a Platonic reality, right? The idea that mathematics has an independence outside the universe, right? And somehow we're accessing it. And how does that happen? Yeah, lots of interesting, wonderful theological, philosophical questions.
Definitely. And Professor, one thing I've been wondering is, at the same time we're talking about the human ingenuity at people like Leibniz or Newton or maybe Pascal and those great mathematical thinkers of our time. Unfortunately it's not that we have a big tradition on Brazil, So one we've been wondering is, does inclusive mathematics adapt to national culture or regional culture? So, for example, how could we adapt it to a country that has, things a lot about, maybe carnival or beaches or football or something like that, Is it adaptable to different cultures in any way?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we have to think about is what is it that is unique to that culture that mathematics taps into? And certainly math is going to tie into something, right? If you think about, if the Brazilian culture has an interest in dance or music, right? Certainly there's a lot of interesting mathematics around rhythm, right? And mathematics around music. Or if you're interested into sports, you can certainly point to the power of sports analytics. People are using that more and more these days to try to understand how to pit various, basketball players against other basketball players in a game, right? Like what statistically, that uses a lot of statistics, right? Statistically speaking, what's going to yield the best advantage. Yeah, so certainly I think part of what it means to teach math inclusively is to think about what it is students want to know and connect math to what they want to know rather than connect them to questions they're not interested
in. Professor, even though I have lots and lots of questions, I'm loving this subject, I need to open for some questions from our audience, or else they're probably going to think I'm trying to monopolize your attention here. So there's this question from João Lima, which is teaching math to children using objects to create a bond an appropriate technique? So what have you tried in teaching children mathematics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not an expert at teaching kids mathematics. I mean, at least at the elementary level. I will be soon because I have a newborn who is going to be at that age pretty soon. But But certainly teaching math with trying to connect math to physical objects seems very reasonable, and should be part of a variety of methods that people might employ.
And also, Guilherme made this question, Professor. What method does he use? So, asking you to bring people together in mathematics. So you were talking about connecting people at the classroom. So how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, okay, so the first thing to say is that there are many ways to bring people together over mathematics that are not just the classroom, right? So, anytime you bring people together to play a game, you're engaging in strategic thinking. And strategic thinking is mathematical thinking, thinking about how it is that, if I'm going to play Settlers of Catan or something, I have to make decisions about how to play. Or, if you bring people together, like, if you have kids that are of, a certain age that they can help you in the kitchen, if you're bringing people together to bake a cake and you're talking about fractions and you're talking about, what happens when you mix this with that in this amount and that amount, that's bringing people together over mathematics, right? Mathematical thinking. You can and should make it a part of all your kids' experiences, right? Anytime you're at the store, having them think a little bit about what change is needed for this and that, asking interesting questions, not just to compute things, but to understand things, right? So, for instance, a computing question would be just to ask a kid to add up a certain amount of change in your wallet. That's boring. It's not so interesting, right? A more exploratory question might be something like, how many different ways can a nickel, can you form a dollar from quarters and dimes, right? So there's an interesting question that involves exploration, putting things together in different ways. That really is much more mathematical thinking, because you're forcing kids to think about what a quarter means and what a dime means. Sorry, I'm sure your currency in Brazil is different. It doesn't have quarters and dimes, but that's an more interesting question. So that's framing mathematics around exploration. So these are all ways to bring people together over mathematics. Now, of course, in the classroom, one of the things that, as a teacher, I have to think about is the fact that there are many different people who come into class with different levels of preparation. Some students, while they may be very, very sharp, may not have the same background as others. And the ones who come in with a lot of background sometimes intimidate the ones who come in with less background. So what I have to think about is how to shape the activities in my class in such a way that it equalizes the fact that some have more preparation and some have less, right? And so it gives people an opportunity to build confidence in their mathematical abilities that's not based on the background that they have. That's one thing I really have to pay attention to. But other than that, of course, I do try to make mathematics more human and help connecting people to some of the stories of mathematics and some of the ways that it should appeal to some of our desires, and people can come together over that as well, right? In terms of sharing their own experiences of wonder and beauty in mathematics. Often like to have students reflect on their experiences, and if you can find a way to do that communally, that can be really powerful.
And for instance, there's this question from Anna, which is actually a follow-up from these virtues that you said. I still don't understand how we can reach justice through mathematics, or, for example, or beauty. Can you give any example of it?
Yeah. So I guess we can talk about. Let's talk about beauty first. So anytime you walk into a cathedral and you see beautiful patterns on the wall, you're having a mathematical experience as well as an emotional experience, right? When you see beautiful patterns that cause you to ask why, that's the beginning of a mathematical question, right? If you see a beautiful pattern on a animal's fur, some spots, and you want to know why, that's a math question, if you see turbulence under an airplane wing, and you see, the beautiful sort of spirals that form, and you ask why, that's a math question. So part of beauty, I think, comes in at a sensory level, and then it builds, right? Because then you start looking at the beauty of ideas, and it's a unique kind of beauty of mathematical ideas, and then even beyond that, there's the beauty of reasoning. When you see a beautiful proof, like you see an elegant demonstration of why something is true, it makes you go, "Whoa, that's beautiful," right? Like,
It is.
I mean, I'll give a very simple example. Like, we're often taught that 3 times 5 is the same as 5 times 3, right? Now, that could just be a fact you memorize or something, but you might ask yourself why that is. And one way to see why that is if you arrange 3 rows of cookies with 5 things in each row, that's 3 times 5, right? But if I take that array of cookies and I turn it sideways, now it's 5 rows of 3 things each, and that's 5 times 3. And suddenly I see why 3 times 5 equals 5 times 3. It's because they both represented by this picture of cookies, just turned a different way, right? That's part of, often there's a lot of ways in mathematics where looking at the same thing in 2 different ways gives you an equality between things you didn't realize had equality. So that's kind of like the beauty of reasoning. And then beyond that, there's what you might often call transcendent beauty, right? The beauty of seeing the same idea pop up in lots of different situations. And that's kind of like the experience you have of deja vu, where you're like, oh my gosh, like I just saw this idea the other day in this other context. There must be something deeper going on, right? So that's kind of like, whoa, like the heavens opened up and the light shines down, and you're like, whoa, I've just seen something profound, right? That's the experience of beauty, and it can happen in many different ways. It's not so dissimilar to people's having various religious experiences, right? In some sense, people often talk about math in very similar ways. As far as justice goes, one of the chapters of my book is just devoted to this idea of thinking about what it means to make mathematics more inclusive, and the unjust situation where some people have more access to mathematics than others. Some people are exposed to more math, and others are turned away from math. And so you can pursue mathematics through the lens of justice and ask, how do we make math, if we believe math should be something everybody has the right to experience, how do we make that possible? But there's also people who are studying using mathematics in issues of fairness and justice. And I didn't talk about that much in the book, but it is part of what I do as a research area, right? I try to connect some of the mathematics that is more classical to questions about how people interact. So that's one area of math known as game theory. It became popular in the mid 1900s, 1950s, 1940s, partly out of World War II and the desire to try to model how strategic people interact. But it's sort of come into its own as an area of mathematics, the mathematical modeling of decision making. It's very popular in economics. And so part of what I do is in a research area is using mathematics to help answer questions about dividing things fairly among several people. That's an area of math known as fair division or fair allocation. But so you can certainly use math to talk about fairness as well.
And Professor, even though I'm feeling really inspired by this conversation, I know you have a newborn at home, so it wouldn't be fair, since we're talking about fairness, to rob you of that many hours. So I'd love to ask you just one last question before we finish, which is, we're doing this event. It's for executives, for entrepreneurs. Yeah. It's for people working in companies that have that, and they do have, as a matter of fact, lots of challenges that has lots to do with mathematics. And there's this question which Carlos made, which I loved it, which is, what would be your idea to engage the employees of a company that still needs to evolve, for example, in data analysis or decision based on data, which is, of course, as a matter of fact, part of inclusive mathematics. So how could we include people inside a company in mathematics? Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah. If I understand you correctly, part of what you're interested in is getting employees some exposure to mathematical ideas at a higher level without necessarily getting caught in the weeds. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so there's lots of popular books that sort of go in that direction. I've certainly written one book, and that's one way you could think about it. Starting conversations, anyways, about what math is and how it can be used for good. But there are several other popular books these days which you might consider as maybe a reading discussion group, for instance. There's the book by Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, which talk about algorithms and how if you don't think about how you use them well, then they can be used for ill. And certainly in the ways we judge people using algorithms. There's another recent book by Steve Strogatz called Infinite Powers that talks about the wonder of calculus. And it sort of keeps at a high level. You're not learning actually how to compute integrals or do anything funny, but you might come away with a different impression of the calculus that if you've learned it in the past by reading a book like that. And then there are other popular books that have come out recently too that sort of explore mathematical ideas. There are many books by Eugenia Chang on mathematical thinking. Another recent book by Susan D'Agostino about how to think like a mathematician. And if you like comic books, there's a book by it's a book about math, but it's got some really interesting comics. It's a book by Ben Orlin, Math with Bad Drawings. And so there's something you might enjoy putting on your company coffee table to start conversations about math.
Professor, it was a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and for inspiring us to be better math thinkers and, of course, to develop the virtues that math gives us. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Obrigado.
Obrigado. It was a pleasure, Professor. Thank you. Pessoal, espero que vocês tenham saído dessa primeira palestra do Frontiers tão inspirado quanto eu saí. Quando eu falei, inclusive, que havia começado a estudar matemática, quando me deparei com um artigo do professor Francis, eu me empolguei muito mais, inclusive. Não por acaso, já me inscrevi nos próximos 6 cursos dessa track de estatística e matemática que eu estou fazendo. Acho que a gente não poderia ter iniciado melhor esse último Frontiers do ano, né? Para a gente aqui na MIT Sloan Review Brasil, é como se o Papai Noel em pessoa tivesse entregado o meu presente. Eu vou pedir para o Juliano, inclusive, colocar na tela novamente o livro do Dr. Su. Não tem esse livro em português ainda, mas a gente, obviamente, vai mandar por e-mail para os participantes uma promoção para quem quiser ler inglês. Enfim, quem se sentir à vontade para ler inglês, eu recomendo muito. Eu, inclusive, estou lendo esse livro e é lindo, apesar de ser um livro sobre matemática, um livro absolutamente inspirador. E como vocês devem ter percebido pela fala do professor Su, existem formas de inspirar por meio da matemática. E, na verdade, acho que não tem português, é uma triste prova de como o Brasil ainda está virado de costas para a matemática, né? Então, que bom que a gente está conseguindo, nesse primeiro dia de Frontiers, incentivar esse pensamento. Então, a gente encerra por aqui e agradece demais a participação de todos vocês. Amanhã a gente tem algumas palestras super interessantes. Tem uma palestra com um pesquisador do MIT que vai esclarecer muitas das nossas dúvidas sobre competitividade no Brasil, do Brasil no mundo. Então, Ângela, por favor, se quiser compartilhar mais alguma coisa, agora é o momento.
Ainda impactada por por toda essa palestra aí do professor Su, meu Deus, foi incrível mesmo. Mas aproveitar aqui, Pedro, e trazer alguns recados, né? Primeiro, agradecer, claro, né, em nome de toda a equipe, a parceria do SAS Brasil, que é fera em analytics e dados. E também lembrar aqui para todos vocês que estão acompanhando Frontiers, que tem 50% de desconto para você assinar a MIT Sloan Review Brasil. Então aproveitem, porque o desconto é bom e o conteúdo é ótimo. E por último, eu também quero lembrar a todos vocês que amanhã o Frontiers começa às 18 horas, justamente com essa palestra que o Pedro falou, que é do Tim Sturgeon, que é do MIT, e que vai ser incrível com certeza. E às 19, a gente continua a nossa programação com outra palestra imperdível da Maria Tereza Leme Fleury, que é uma das pessoas que mais estudam internacionalização, foi difícil sair isso, gente, de empresas brasileiras. Ela tem aí mais de 20 anos que ela estuda esse processo, né, das empresas irem para fora. Então, imagina o quanto de conhecimento que ela pode trazer, e ela vai explicar como que todo esse processo tem tudo a ver com tecnologia. Então, amanhã a gente espera todos vocês aqui novamente. Uma boa noite e até amanhã.